सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Lloyd James Austin, the US Secretary of Defense, has been in town, and you've seen pictures of him with our Defense Minister, Rajnath Singh. They've been talking about many things, but it is the general understanding that the center point of what they've been talking about is the next step in the India-US high-level and high-tech defense and security and strategic affairs partnership. Successive leaders of the two countries, three successive prime ministers of India, I would say four. Narasimha Rao, not fully. Narasimha Rao like hugging somebody like this, but Vajpayee like this, Manmohan Singh like this, and Narendra Modi like this. So four successive prime ministers from India and four successive presidents from America. That is Clinton, George Bush Jr., Obama, Donald Trump, and now Biden, the fifth, right? They've all been repeating the same line with greater emphasis with each successive presidency and prime ministership that India and the US are essential strategic allies, natural and essential strategic allies. Now, what is the test of a strategic alliance? The test is how much do you trust your ally with what is most critical or what is most valuable to you, and what is it that you are most possessive about. Now, it's easy to think, oh, what should the Americans be more possessive about but the dollar? No, it's not that. Big countries, particularly countries with security interest or interest in security area, the thing that they are most possessive about is sensitive military technology or technology going into cutting edge and sensitive military equipments. Now, when it comes to that, in fighter aircraft making, the engine, the power plant, the engine is the holy grail of the fighter aircraft making. That is what India and America are now talking about. This is not the deal that is done yet. You will see more on this deal as the Prime Minister goes to Washington in a couple of weeks, and we are hoping, the anticipation is that this deal will go through, that India will now begin to get technology, transfer of technology and co-manufacturing of the American GE414 engine. GE414 is the cutting edge engine right now for fighter planes across the Western world. In the Western world, most frontline fighters, forget the French fighters. The French always do everything on their own. So the French have their own engines. The Rafale has its own engines, French engines. But all of the rest of the Western world's fighters are built around the same GE414 engine. So many of the American frontline aircraft, F-18 Super Hornet, again European aircraft, also use American engines, the same engine. The Swedish fighter aircraft Saab Gripen, they all use the same engine. Also, the Swedes say that they are working on their own engine, but that's been going on for a long time. Even when the Swedes made their earlier aircraft, which was once offered to Indian Air Force, in fact, all of the Swedish aircraft have been offered to Indian Air Force. Indian Air Force has never shown so much interest in them. Even that, although it had a modified engine, that engine was also based on a Pratt & Whitney design. So, making fighter aircraft engine, frontline fighter aircraft engine, is a very complicated process. GE414 is currently the most used fighter engine in the Western world, and India wants it. India, in fact, shortlisted this in 2010, as far back as in 2010. If I take you back to the GE website, and you will see a screenshot from the GE website on your screen, and this is a screenshot from October 1, 2010. This says that HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, has shortlisted or has marked out 99 engines of the same type, GE414, for the Tejas Mark II program. Now, 2010, Tejas Mark II was a pie in the sky. Now, Tejas Mark II looks like a reality that's very close to us because we have Tejas operational now in 2 squadrons of the Indian Air Force. Indian Air Force seems to love it. Tejas Mark 1A will come next year and will begin to replace, first of all, the 3 squadrons, the 3 of the last remaining squadrons of MiG-21 BIS. Once that is over, by that time, Tejas Mark 2 will start coming in. Tejas Mark II is essentially different from Mark 1A because until Mark 1A, Tejas is still in the light combat aircraft or LCA category. Once it goes into Mark II, it becomes medium weight, which means it can carry more weapon load, it can carry more fuel, it can carry better radars, it can fly over a longer distance. Also, it can stay up in the air for much longer. So that becomes an aircraft in a completely different category. And when Tejas Mark II starts coming in, that will start replacing that other set of aircraft which we hear very little about, but which is really as obsolete today as MiG-21 Bison. In fact, in some ways, even more. That is the Jaguar. The Indian Air Force has 5 squadrons of the Jaguar. Indian Navy has 1 squadron. That is the maritime version. Carries maritime missiles, is very effective, is not supposed to go that far. It's an aircraft with short legs, and as a story by Snehesh Alex Philip, our defense editor, on August 19, 2019, 4 years back. I will share a link with you. As that story told us, already 4 years back, that engine was short on life and short of power. So the 2 engines on which these Jaguar aircraft were riding, they had already lost 15 to 30% of their power. And there was a plan to re-engine them, to buy new engines, and that was a plan that was being discussed or negotiated with the manufacturing company Honeywell until the Indian Air Force realized, as that story by Snehesh Alex Phillips told us, they realized that it will be much too expensive to buy engines for this aircraft because each aircraft needs 2 engines. So for the cost of up-engineering 2 aircraft, you could buy 1 new Rafale, right? It's just not a very good deal then to keep putting such expensive engines on such an old airframe, again, which will have limitations of radar, avionics, etc., etc. Also, one of the latest Sukhoi 30s with its suite of armaments and electronics, they are not the best in the world, but electronics and armaments, they carry the BrahMos missile also now. One can do the job of 2 Jaguars. In fact, that's also a little bit of a simplistic comparison because it's not a question just of numbers. 1 Sukhoi will not come up against 2 Jaguars. It's just a question of how much weapon load, how much war load can an aircraft system deliver over what range effectively, accurately, and safely. And if you look at that, then 2 Jaguars, 3 Jaguars simply won't compare with any amount bound to whatever number of Sukhoi. Jaguar is a completely different generation. Jaguars were ordered by the Janata Party government between 1977-78 as usual with the purchase of any foreign weapon system. There was a controversy, but they went through with it. This has been a very useful aircraft. Then it was called a DPSA. DPSA means Deep Penetration Strike Aircraft. So the aircraft was meant to fly low, fly low, go into enemy territory, flying low to evade radar, hit the target accurately and come back. Now these concepts of air combat have completely changed. Now air combat or air to ground combat is all about standoff weapons, and it's not about suffering attrition. It's about minimizing attrition. If you say that, then you need today's strike aircraft. If the strike aircraft of 70s and 80s had to have the ability to fly low, evade radar, get on top of the target, drop their bombs. Today, nobody has to go on top of the target because all targets are very well defended anyway. Today, you have to be as far away from the target as possible and fire off your standoff weapons or your guided weapons from there. So some of those weapons have been fitted onto the current Jaguars also. You might have seen that after the attack on Balakot, next day when the Pakistan Air Force came, while the F-16s were doing their own tamasha, they also had Mirage 5 variants which were staying on the Pakistani side but dropping off their standoff weapons from there on the Indian Brigade headquarters or thereabouts. These were again guided weapons. So similarly, Jaguars can perform that role but not over very long distances because then there are limitations to what kind of weapons even if they are standoff weapons, what kind of weapons they can carry. And certainly the idea of going on top of the target deep inside Pakistani or Chinese territory doesn't work anymore. So these aircraft are already obsolete. Snehesh's story told us that pilots already were concerned about the loss of power in the engines, and the joke among the pilots used to be that if one engine fails, Jaguar is a two-engine aircraft, if one engine fails, the other engine cannot take you any further than your point of crash, where the aircraft will crash. It's a terrible thing to say. It cannot take you back to safety. So that aircraft is definitely on low power right now. So much on low power and so inadequate are its engines, and they are running out of life, that in peacetime the aircraft actually is flown at low power, that is to conserve their engine strength. So that will be the next lot of aircraft to be replaced. And today the plan is that those will be replaced by Tejas Mark II. It is for those aircraft that this engine will be required. Now, manufacturing an engine is a very complex process. It is so complex that in the world today, outside of the Russian bloc, outside of Russia, only the P5 countries, Russia and to an extent China, because Chinese make copies, right? Chinese don't make their own engines, they make copies of Russian engines. So outside of the P5 includes China, outside of the Western world only China, but outside of the P5, no other country manufactures its own jet fighter engine. That is the reality. I told you even the Swedes for Gripen use the GE414 engine. So this is the engine that HAL should now, I'm not saying will, because nothing is done until the fine print is read and until both sides sign on the dotted line and US Congress has given its approvals. There's a 30-day period for that. But it doesn't seem that that should be a problem. When that happens, India will start manufacturing a frontline engine for the first time. Now, it will not start manufacturing this engine from day one. HAL will first start making components, etc., develop expertise. Maybe it will still be a few years before a full engine is put together in India or is manufactured in India. Although expectation would be on the Indian side, and I hope that comes true, that in the course of time, India will start manufacturing a bulk of the GE414 and its further developments, its further future improved models, even for export elsewhere, because this engine will continue to be a large demand everywhere. So the Americans are looking out, and Americans have also figured now that if they have to strengthen their alliances, they have competition with China. For 30 years after the end of the Cold War, they did not see competition. Now they see competition. So they are reaching out to their allies. For example, they've also signed up a transfer of technology deal with South Korea for the same engine. But South Korea, remember, is a treaty-bound ally of the Americans. India is not a treaty-bound ally. But India has a NATO plus status in the American scheme of things now. So to that extent, it's a big progress. Now, India, if you look at India's history of manufacturing aircraft, one thing India has always struggled with is engines. India has also almost never made an aircraft of its own. A jet fighter, India made one. India designed one, the HF-24 Maruth. In fact, once we dedicated almost an entire episode of Cut The Clutter to it. You can check it out. I will share a link with you. Now, HF-24 Maruth came out in idealistic times. That's when Nehru and leaders under him, they thought that India had the scale, had the demand, and had the skills and industrial base and scientific base to develop a fighter aircraft of its own, a jet fighter aircraft and a supersonic jet fighter aircraft of its own. And Nehru and that government, I know that sometimes people seem to think that life began with Google, that nothing happened in the world before Google, and definitely nothing happened in India before 2014. But you know, in the 50s, late 40s, 50s also, Nehru and his government reached out looking for engineers, particularly aircraft engineers, which might have been thrown out of their jobs in Germany after the defeat of the Nazis. So many of the German scientists, many of the German engineers then had gone to Latin American countries. These were not Nazis. These were genuine scientists. These were not members of the Nazi parties. Germans were very good at aircraft manufacturing. So Nehru and his government, they hired a German engineer called Kurt Tank. Kurt Tank, with his design bureau, was brought into India, was given a space, and he began designing this Indian fighter aircraft, which in the course of time was named HF-24, Hindustan Fighter 24, Marut. Marut means wind. It's also an allusion to Lord Hanuman. Now, Marut was built with two engines, but India could not develop an engine. India tried to build an engine but failed. Then there was an Indian-Egyptian joint project. This was Nasir's Egypt. There was an Indian-Egyptian joint project to develop a fighter engine, but that also did not work. Ultimately, what did we stick into HF-24? Ultimately, HAL, Indian Air Force, the Design Bureau, they decided to experiment with an engine that HAL already had. This was an engine called the Bristol Siddeley Orpheus engine. Orpheus engine had been imported into India because it went into the NAT fighter aircraft. NAT was a tiny fighter aircraft, tiny, very agile. It was noted greatly in the 1965 war against the Sabre. Now, this engine powered the NAT. Two of these engines were then used to power the HF-24. These were found to be inadequate, particularly to give a supersonic thrust to the aircraft, although the NAT in its trials sometimes, particularly in a dive, could break the sound barrier, but that was just a theoretical thing. For this aircraft to be supersonic, these two engines were not good enough. So, Indian engineers at Gas Turbine Research Establishment then further worked on it and modified it. So, they produced a modified version of the Bristol Siddeley Orpheus 12 that was called Orpheus 703. That had afterburners or reheat as it's called. You see, when a jet fighter aircraft wants to engage more power, wants to increase its thrust, you see it emitting those flames. That's the afterburner. So, they developed an afterburner version of this engine. Two of these were stuck into the HF-24 and yet the aircraft was underpowered. So that airframe was a good airframe. It was designed by the Code Tank Bureau. Indian engineers were involved, but India could never get an engine to adequately power it. So some copies of this aircraft were used in the 71 war, but sparingly, not in a lot of complex combat situations, and ultimately a lot of the aircraft had to be wasted. Almost 100 aircraft had to be written off because nobody was willing to use them anymore. So a very good experiment. India's only effort so far until Tejas, India's only nearly successful effort to produce a fighter aircraft, a frontline fighter aircraft of its own, failed. Why? Simply because India could not produce an engine and no other country was willing to give India an engine. Now you will ask me, how come Sukhoi 30s? Now these Russian aircraft or Soviet aircraft, either the engines are imported or engine components are imported and assembled, and sometimes a lot of the other stuff are imported from which components may be assembled, and then the engines are assembled. So just because these engines are assembled in India, India has not developed the ability, unfortunately, to develop an engine of its own. GTRE, that is the Gas Turbine Research Establishment in Bangalore, has been working on an Indian engine. In fact, I have written stories about it in India Today in 1985, 1987. That's when they gave a name to this engine. They called it the Kaveri engine. And they said, check it out. Now, a bunch of copies or prototypes of that engine were created. I think 9 prototypes were created. They were put through several 100 hours of testing, including in Russia, but they failed. And that's how I don't think the project has been formally abandoned, but India has not been able to develop a jet engine. Again, you will ask me, the helicopters, advanced light helicopter, the various versions, Dhruv, Prachand, Rudra, what power plant, what engine are they riding, you may ask me. So that is an engine, again, which HAL is making, it in partnership with the French company Safran. Now, Safran, Rolls-Royce, they've all been in the race to do joint manufacture of engines with India. But today, when it comes to frontline fighter aircraft, the most popular and the most used engine is GE 414. And there is a continuity there because Tejas so far, Tejas that we are using right now, that uses GE 404, which is like the earlier model. Its next model or the improved model is G414, and after that there will be more. So India is hoping that when India develops its own AMCA, and see this picture on a visit to the ADA, which is Aeronautics Development Establishment in Bengaluru, along the HAL campus, I saw this model also, which is scientists who are designing AMCA sort of displayed and explained to me. When this becomes a reality, this will then have an up-engined version of the GE414. So once this technology comes in, if it does, and I hope it does, that will then resolve one of the big problems of India's domestic aviation manufacture, that is the inability to manufacture an engine. And between India and America, this will then underline the maturing of a relationship, because in 2022, last year, when President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi met, they had then signed off on something called India-US Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, that is ICET, I small and CET, Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies. This F414 partnership will be very much a part of that and an evidence of that. And therefore, this partnership between India through HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, and with America through GE for the GE F414 engines, if this comes through, that will be evidence that this critical partnership, ICET, that is Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, is really working. That's why watch this space, particularly when the Prime Minister goes to Washington on 22nd of June. How India's military aviation has struggled for power. Power means for engine power, is exemplified by the picture you see on your screens. This aircraft, Fairchild Packet, this came from Canada, US assistance during the Chinese invasion of 1962, before and after, when the Western world tried to help India. This aircraft, Fairchild Packet, was supposed to supply and transport Indian troops in the highest Himalayan ranges in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, NEFA then. Now, this aircraft was seen to be underpowered for India's requirements, particularly at higher altitude. So what did India do? India and the engineers from the companies that manufactured this aircraft, they then decided to put the Packet is a piston engine aircraft. The Packet runs on piston engines, propeller piston engines, really old aircraft. On top of the aircraft, on the fuselage, and you will see this on your screen, they fitted a third engine. So see, that third engine looks different from the other two engines because this is a jet engine. This is the same Orpheus engine that was fitted in the NAT, and a version of which then went into 2 copies in the HF-24 because this engine was available. So this was a strange aircraft, neither fish nor fowl, na titar na bater, neither a partridge nor a quail. It had 2 propeller engines and 1 jet engine, which also means, and I presume so, that this aircraft used 2 kinds of fuel. One for its propeller engines and second for its jet engine. But you know what? This gave it some power, and with that additional engine power, this aircraft was able to use short airstrips in Ladakh and Arunachal, etc., etc. So this struggle for engine power has been there for as long as military aviation has been there in independent India. And hopefully, as India starts making these engines, if in joint manufacture, that will be a big step forward.